It was one of those afternoons that looked peaceful from the outside but carried a sense of rush in the air. The traffic was steady, the sun had started dipping low, and the streets were filled with people returning home after a long day. Among them was a young woman driving back from work, humming softly to herself, not knowing that within the next few minutes, her life and someone else's was about to change forever. She had just turned onto the main highway when a sharp noise made her flinch. It sounded like a tire bursting or metal scraping against metal. She looked up and saw a few cars ahead, a silver SUV swerving wildly before crashing into the side railing. The sound of the impact made everyone around slow down. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. Then came the smoke. Thick, dark smoke started curling from the front of the vehicle. Most drivers slowed to watch. Some honked, a few stopped at a distance, unsure of what to do. The woman pressed on her brakes, her heart racing. She could see people inside the car, movement in the front seat, and then, faintly, the small hand of a child against the window in the back. Her instincts kicked in before her thoughts did. She pulled her car over, threw open the door, and ran toward the burning SUV. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and heavy. The front of the vehicle was already catching fire. The heat was unbearable even from a few feet away. She could hear muffled cries, the sound of a child screaming in panic. She shouted for help, hoping someone would follow. A few bystanders had gathered, but no one moved close enough. Some were calling emergency numbers, some were shouting for fire extinguishers, but time was slipping away. The fire was spreading fast. The woman didn't think twice. She ran around to the back door of the SUV and tried to open it. It was jammed. She pulled again with all her strength, her hands shaking. It wouldn't move. Smoke filled her eyes, making them sting. She coughed and stepped back, trying to see another way in. That's when she spotted a rock near the curb. Without hesitation, she grabbed it, swung it as hard as she could against the side window, and heard the glass crack. She hit it again and again until the glass shattered into pieces. The heat was so intense now that it felt like standing beside an open furnace. Her hair stuck to her forehead and her throat burned with smoke. But she could see the child clearly now. A little boy, maybe 2 or 3 years old, strapped into a car seat, crying helplessly. She reached inside through the broken glass, ignoring the shards that cut her arm, and struggled with the seatbelt latch. It was stuck. Her hands were trembling, but she kept going, tugging, pressing, praying it would come loose before the flames reached them. Finally, with a click, the latch opened. She pulled the boy out, wrapping him in her arms as he cried against her chest. She turned and ran as fast as she could away from the car, her lungs screaming for air. Just a few seconds after she reached the side of the road, there was a loud pop from the car engine, followed by a burst of flames shooting upward. The vehicle was completely engulfed now. She fell to her knees on the pavement, clutching the child tightly, both of them shaking. The little boy was coughing, his small face streaked with tears and soot. She tried to calm him, whispering that he was safe, that everything was okay now. But even as she said the words, her own voice trembled. She could barely believe what had just happened. People started rushing over finally now that the danger seemed a little further away. Someone handed her a bottle of water. Another person was on the phone with emergency services. A man took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. But she barely heard the voices around her. She just kept looking at the child, brushing ash from his hair, making sure he was breathing normally. It wasn't until she heard the sirens in the distance that she allowed herself to take a full breath. The sound of the approaching fire trucks and ambulances made her close her eyes for a moment, letting the relief sink in. Her hands were still trembling. Her arm was bleeding from the glass cuts, but she didn't care. The boy was alive. That was all that mattered. When the first responders arrived, everything turned into a blur of movement. Firefighters rushed toward the burning car with hoses. Paramedics came toward her with stretchers and oxygen masks. Someone carefully took the boy from her arms to check his vitals, but he cried and reached for her again. The paramedic smiled gently and said, "He's okay. You saved him." She didn't even realize she was crying until then. The tears came quietly, not out of pain, but from the sudden wave of emotions that hit her all at once. Fear, relief, exhaustion. She sat there on the curb, staring at the flashing lights, the black smoke, the crowd that had gathered. People were taking videos, some whispering about how she had run straight into the fire, but she wasn't thinking about any of that. She just hoped the boy's parents were safe. A police officer walked over, knelt down beside her, and asked softly, "Miss, are you okay? Do you need medical help?" She shook her head, though she clearly wasn't fine. Her arm hurt, her clothes were covered in soot, and her chest still burned from inhaling smoke. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "Just make sure he's okay." The officer nodded. "He's fine. You did something very brave today. Not many people would have done what you did." She didn't answer. She didn't see it as bravery. In that moment, all she could think about was that small hand she saw pressed against the window. That image wouldn't leave her mind. A few minutes later, one of the paramedics came back and told her that the boy was doing well. He was scared, but he'd be okay. They said they'd be taking him to the hospital for a checkup, just to be safe. The woman nodded, feeling her shoulders finally relax. Someone had parked her car a few meters away, still with the engine running. She walked back slowly, her legs weak, her mind spinning. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving the sky painted in deep orange and purple. The smell of burned rubber and gasoline still lingered in the air. Before she got into her car, she turned to look one last time. The firefighters were still hosing down the remains of the SUV. The flashing lights of the police cars painted the street in red and blue. The boy was in an ambulance, his tiny face visible through the glass window, looking around with wide eyes. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. He didn't cry this time. He just looked at her, quiet and curious, holding a small stuffed toy a paramedic had given him. She smiled faintly and raised her hand in a small wave. Then she drove away, still shaken but somehow feeling something deep inside her heart shift. She didn't know who that child belonged to. She didn't know what kind of man or woman would show up at that scene once the news spread. But she did know one thing: she couldn't have left him there. No matter what. As she drove down the quiet streets, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a strange calm. Her mind replayed every detail, the glass breaking, the smoke, the little boy's cries. It all felt unreal, like a dream she couldn't fully understand. She stopped at a red light and caught her reflection in the mirror. There was ash on her cheeks and her eyes looked tired but alive. For the first time in a long while, she realized how fragile life really was. One moment, everything was normal. The next, it could all disappear. When she reached home, she sat in her car for a while before going inside. The silence felt strange after all the noise and chaos. Her phone buzzed with missed calls and messages. Friends, co-workers, maybe even strangers who had already seen the videos being shared online. But she didn't open any of them. She just sat there staring out the window, listening to the quiet hum of the night. She didn't know that at that very moment. The child's father, a man whose name was known across the country, was being rushed from a business meeting by his security team, his heart pounding as he was told that his son had been pulled from a burning car by a woman whose name no one yet knew, but he would find her, and what he would do next would surprise the world. The morning after the rescue felt strangely quiet. The woman woke up with the faint smell of smoke still clinging to her hair and clothes. Her arm was bandaged from the glass cuts and her body ached like she had run a marathon. For a few seconds, she stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together if everything that happened the day before was real or just some kind of dream. But the soreness in her muscles and the faint burn marks on her jacket reminded her that it had all been painfully real. Her phone was buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. Dozens of missed calls, messages, and social media notifications filled the screen. Her coworkers, friends, even people she hadn't spoken to in years had sent her links and voice notes. Some were crying, some cheering, some simply in disbelief. The video of her rescue had gone viral overnight. Someone had recorded the whole thing. The moment she broke the glass, pulled the child out, and ran as the car burst into flames. The internet had already given her a name: the angel on Highway 47. She scrolled for a moment, her stomach tightening. There were clips from news channels, interviews with witnesses, and endless comments from strangers calling her brave, fearless, and selfless. But she didn't feel any of those things. She hadn't acted out of bravery. It was instinct. She just saw a child in danger and moved. She put her phone aside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat quietly by the window. The city outside looked the same as always, noisy, busy, full of people rushing somewhere. But she felt different now, as if she was watching life from a small distance, still catching up with what had happened. Later that morning, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, 2 men in suits were standing there, looking serious but polite. One of them showed an ID. He said they were part of a private security team working for the family of the boy she rescued. Before she could even process that, one of them said softly. His father would like to meet you in person. She froze. His father? Yes, ma'am. He wanted to thank you himself. If you're comfortable, we can take you there. Her first instinct was to say no. She didn't want attention, didn't want to face cameras or reporters. But the man's tone was calm and genuine, not forceful. He's not asking for an interview, he added. He just wants to meet the person who saved his son's life. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, she said quietly. Just for a short while. The drive took about half an hour. The car moved through quiet, tree-lined streets until they reached the gates of a large modern house that looked more like a private estate. It was peaceful, surrounded by tall hedges and open lawns. She felt suddenly small, stepping into a world she didn't belong to. Elegant, spotless, the kind of place people only saw in magazines. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed. She was led through a hallway to a wide living room filled with sunlight. On the far side, she saw the boy she had rescued sitting on the floor with a nurse playing with toy cars. He looked perfectly healthy now, his cheeks pink and his smile shy but bright, and beside him stood his father. He was taller than she expected, dressed simply but with the quiet confidence of someone used to control. When he saw her, he paused for a long second as if words had suddenly failed him. Then he walked over slowly and extended his hand. Thank you, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. There aren't enough words for what you did yesterday. You saved my son. You saved my world. She shook his hand awkwardly, unsure how to respond. I'm just glad he's okay, she said softly. That's what matters. He looked at her as if trying to understand her. This ordinary woman who had done something extraordinary without expecting anything in return. May I ask your name? He said gently. She told him, and he repeated it quietly like he wanted to remember it. I've seen many things in my life, he said, but I've never seen anyone run toward fire when everyone else ran away. The little boy looked up then, recognizing her. His eyes widened and he smiled shyly before running to her. He clung to her leg and said something soft and innocent that made her eyes well up. The father stood back for a moment, his face breaking into a small emotional smile. Ever since yesterday, he said, he's been talking about you nonstop. I think he knows you're the reason he's still here. She crouched down, brushed the boy's hair and said, You were very brave too. You know. For the next few minutes, the three of them talked quietly. The father asked her if she was hurt, if she had received proper medical care, if she needed anything at all. She kept saying she was fine. But it was clear he wasn't the kind of man who easily accepted fine as an answer. Then he did something she didn't expect. He invited her to stay for lunch. At first, she refused politely. I really should get going, she said. I don't want to intrude. You're not intruding, he insisted gently. You risked your life for my child. Please stay, just for a meal. She hesitated again, but eventually agreed. Maybe out of politeness, maybe because she could see the sincerity in his eyes. The lunch was simple but warm. There were no reporters, no cameras, just a quiet table where conversation came naturally. He asked about her life, her work, what she enjoyed doing. She told him she worked with children at a local preschool, and that maybe that's why she couldn't stop herself yesterday. She saw a child in danger, and everything else disappeared. He listened carefully, not interrupting once. She noticed that despite his wealth and position, he didn't carry himself like someone arrogant or untouchable. He spoke gently, asked real questions, and laughed softly when his son tried to show her his favorite toy car between bites. At one point, he leaned back and said, You know, I've spent years surrounded by people who only come close because they want something from me. Yesterday reminded me that real kindness still exists. She didn't know how to answer that. She just smiled faintly and said, I think kindness is always around. It just doesn't make headlines often. He nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. Maybe it should. When lunch was over, she stood to leave, insisting she didn't need anything in return. But he walked her to the door and said, If you ever need anything at all, promise me you'll call. My team will make sure you have this. He handed her a small card. No title, no company name, just a private number written neatly. She took it, unsure if she'd ever use it, and smiled. Thank you, but really I didn't do it for a favor. I know, he said softly. That's exactly why it means so much. As she left, the boy waved from the doorway, holding a small stuffed bear in his hand. She waved back, her heart swelling unexpectedly. She didn't know why. But something about that small child's smile stayed with her long after she drove away. That night, her story was everywhere. News anchors spoke about her bravery. Social media was filled with clips of her visit to the mansion, though she hadn't even realized someone nearby had taken photos of her arrival. People admired her humility. They said she refused any money or gifts and that she simply said, "I did what anyone would have done." But deep down, she knew that wasn't completely true. Most people wouldn't have run toward fire. Still, she didn't want fame or interviews. She turned down every media request that came her way. What she wanted was peace and to go back to her normal life. But life, as she would soon learn, wasn't ready to let her slip back quietly. A week later, she received a letter delivered by hand. Inside was a simple note written in the same neat handwriting she'd seen on the card. "You gave me back my son. I want to give something back to the world in your name. Please allow me to honor your courage." Attached to the note was a short document outlining a new charity fund, the Hope for Little Hearts Foundation, created to support underprivileged children with education and health care. Her name was written at the top as the foundation's inspiration. She was stunned. She hadn't asked for recognition or money. But here it was, something beautiful born from a terrifying moment. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, her chest tightening with emotion. It wasn't about fame. It was about what that man had chosen to do with the second chance his son got. When she finally met him again to talk about the foundation, she realized something even more profound. He wasn't just doing this out of gratitude. He was doing it because her act had changed the way he saw the world. Before the accident, he said, his life was all business, schedules, and numbers. After the fire, after seeing a stranger risk her life for his child, he couldn't go back to living like before. "You reminded me," he said quietly, "that humanity isn't a word. It's an action." She didn't know how to respond, so she simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest echoes." From that day, a quiet friendship began between them, one built not on fame or wealth, but on something deeply human: gratitude, respect, and the memory of a moment when two lives crossed because of courage. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a small child kept asking for bedtime stories about the lady who saved me from the fire. Weeks passed after the foundation was announced, but life for her still felt strange. Everywhere she went, people seemed to recognize her. Some would whisper softly. Others would come up to her with smiles and say things like, "You're that woman from the news, right? The one who saved the little boy?" At first, she didn't know how to handle it. She wasn't used to attention, and every time someone mentioned it, she felt shy, even embarrassed. She didn't see herself as a hero. She had only done what her heart told her to do. But now her face was in newspapers, online articles, and even on talk shows she never thought she'd ever be mentioned on. One afternoon, while she was finishing her work at the preschool, the receptionist came to her and said, "Someone's here to see you." She walked out, thinking it was maybe a parent, but instead, she saw the man she had met weeks ago, the boy's father, standing quietly near the entrance with a warm smile. He wasn't dressed like a powerful businessman today. He wore a simple shirt, his sleeves rolled up, and he looked more relaxed than before. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said politely. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." She wiped her hands on a towel, still surprised to see him. "Of course, come in. I have a few minutes before the kids leave." He followed her to a small bench near the playground where children's laughter filled the air. He watched them play for a moment and smiled faintly. "It's peaceful here," he said softly. "A very different kind of world," she nodded. "It is. Children remind you what really matters." He turned to her, serious now. "You know the foundation we started, the one inspired by your act?" "Yes," she said. "I saw the announcement. It was wonderful. I want you to be a part of it," he said directly. "Not just in name, but in heart. I want you to help guide it, decide where the funds go, visit schools, hospitals, be the face of it. You understand compassion better than anyone I've met." She blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I don't know anything about running charities. I'm just," he interrupted gently. "You're the reason this exists. You don't need to know business. You already understand humanity." For a long moment, she didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to say no, to stay in her quiet routine. away from cameras and big decisions. But another part of her felt something stir inside. Maybe this was a way to do more good, to help more children, to turn one act of courage into something lasting. "I'll think about it," she finally said. He smiled. "That's all I ask." Before leaving, he waved to the children and handed her a small envelope. "Some photos," he said. "From the hospital. He wanted you to have them." Inside were pictures of his little boy smiling brightly, playing with blocks, healthy and happy. There was even one where he held up a crayon drawing of her next to a car, flames in the background and a big red heart above. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, the boy had written, "My hero." She felt tears sting her eyes. "He remembered," she whispered. "He never forgot," the man said softly. "Neither did I." That night she couldn't stop thinking about it. The foundation, the children, that small drawing. It all reminded her that maybe her story wasn't meant to end with that rescue. Maybe it was the beginning of something greater. The next morning she called him and said, "I'll do it. I'll help however I can." From that day on, her life began to change again, but this time, it wasn't out of chaos or fear, but purpose. She started attending meetings, visiting orphanages, and listening to stories of children who had dreams but no means to reach them. She wasn't used to being in boardrooms or giving speeches. But whenever she spoke, people listened, not because of fancy words, but because her sincerity showed in every line she said. One day, at a small event in a local school, she saw him again. He had come quietly without media, standing at the back of the hall watching her speak. Afterward, he walked up and said, "You've found your place, haven't you?" She smiled. "Maybe I have, it feels..." "Right," he nodded, looking proud. "You're helping more people than you realize." They began meeting often, sometimes for foundation work, sometimes just for coffee and conversation. He would ask about her students and she'd ask about his son. Slowly, they became comfortable around each other, sharing parts of their lives that few others knew. He told her that after the accident, he couldn't sleep for days, thinking of what could have happened. It had made him realize how distant he had become from the things that truly mattered. "I built companies, earned everything I thought I wanted," he said once. "But none of it meant anything when I thought I'd lost him." She listened quietly, understanding more than she said. She told him about her own past, too, how she grew up in a small town raised by her grandmother, who always told her that kindness was the only thing that never lost value. "Maybe that's why I ran that day," she said softly. "It wasn't courage. It was just what she taught me." He smiled at that. "Then your grandmother raised someone remarkable." As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened, not in the loud, dramatic way stories often tell, but in a quiet, genuine way that grows between two people who understand each other. They shared lunches during foundation trips, laughed over small things, and celebrated every child whose life they could help change. But even with all the progress, she never forgot how it all started. That day on the highway, the smoke, the fear, and the small hand pressed against the glass. One afternoon, while visiting a children's shelter built through the foundation, she saw the boy again. He ran straight to her the moment she entered, shouting her name. He was taller now, healthier, his laughter brighter than ever. He wrapped his little arms around her and said, "Daddy says you're the reason I can play today." Her heart melted. "You're the reason I keep going," she said softly. The father stood behind, watching them with gentle eyes. Later, as they stood outside, he said quietly, "I think he loves you almost as much as he loves me." She laughed lightly. "Children just remember kindness. That's all." "No," he said. "They remember love." She looked at him for a long second, unsure what to say. There was something in his tone, something warm, unspoken but deeply sincere. After that day, their paths crossed even more often. Whenever there was a new project or a visit planned, they would work side by side. She started noticing the little things. How he always carried his son's drawings in his briefcase. How he paused before making big decisions. How he treated every child they helped as if they were his own. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he offered to drive her home. The city lights glowed softly through the car windows, and for a while they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore, it was peaceful. Finally, he said, "You know, I never believed in fate before. I thought life was just about choices and effort. But meeting you changed that." She turned slightly. "Why?" Because sometimes, he said quietly, the right people appear at the exact moment you need them most. She didn't know how to reply. She simply smiled, and for the first time since that terrifying day, her heart felt light. The next few months were filled with purpose. The foundation grew quickly. Schools were renovated, orphanages received supplies, and scholarships were granted. Every event seemed to carry the same message. One act of kindness can spark 1,000 more. People admired them both, not as a powerful man and a rescuer, but as two people who turned tragedy into hope. One morning, during a foundation press conference, a reporter asked him on camera, "Why did you decide to dedicate so much of your resources to this cause?" He looked straight into the camera, then toward her and said, "Because one person reminded me that true strength isn't in power. It's in compassion. The day she ran into that fire, she didn't just save my son, she saved a part of me too." The room fell silent. Cameras clicked, but all she could do was look down, overwhelmed. It wasn't fame she wanted, it was meaning. And somehow, without even planning it, she had found both. That evening, he called her to apologize if his words made her uncomfortable. She laughed and said, "You only said the truth." He hesitated. "Still, I didn't mean to put you in the spotlight again." "It's all right," she said softly. "Maybe the world needs more stories like this, ones that remind people what love and courage really look like." He paused, then said something that made her heart skip a beat. "You know, sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if you hadn't been there that day." She smiled gently. "Maybe you'd have found another reason to believe in good." He shook his head. "No, I think that reason was always meant to be you." There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Soft, meaningful silence. Neither of them said anything more, but both understood what the other felt. It was no longer just gratitude that connected them. It was something deeper, built slowly over shared compassion, long talks, and quiet understanding. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew that the fire that had once destroyed so much had also lit something new in their lives, something that would only grow stronger with time. Time moved forward quietly, but some moments refused to fade. Even though months had passed since the day of the fire, it still felt fresh in both their minds, not in a painful way anymore, but as a turning point that connected two very different worlds. The foundation kept growing faster than anyone expected. What had started as a small act of gratitude had now become a movement that inspired others to give, help, and believe in goodness again. Schools across the city had new classrooms. Children who once dreamed in silence now had scholarships. Every time she visited one of those places, she saw faces filled with hope, and it reminded her why she had agreed to be part of this journey. But it wasn't just the foundation that had changed. The bond between her and him had deepened quietly. They spent more time together, sometimes because of work, sometimes just because they wanted to. It had become normal for them to meet after long days, share tea or a quiet dinner, and talk about things that had nothing to do with business or charity. He had stopped being the powerful man everyone saw him as. Around her, he was just a father, a listener, a person trying to make up for lost time with life itself. And she, though still shy and humble, had started to open up in ways she hadn't before. One evening, after a charity event that lasted longer than expected, they ended up on the terrace of the venue. The city lights sparkled below like a sea of tiny stars. The air was cool, and the sound of laughter from downstairs floated up softly. He looked at her and said, "You know, when I first met you, I thought I'd thank you once and move on. But somehow, every time I try to step back, life brings you closer again." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe that's because life doesn't always follow plans. Sometimes it writes its own." He chuckled quietly. "You talk like someone who understands fate." "I don't know about fate," she said softly, "but I do believe everything happens for a reason." They stood there in silence for a while. The world felt calm, as if time had slowed down just for them. Then he said almost in a whisper, "You've changed me in ways I didn't think were possible." She looked at him, unsure what to say. There was something sincere in his eyes, something that made her heart skip for just a second. But before she could respond, one of his assistants appeared to remind him about his car waiting downstairs, and the moment passed. After that night, things shifted slightly between them. They didn't talk about what had almost been said, but it lingered between every smile, every quiet glance. Still, she focused on her work with the foundation. She poured her heart into every visit, every project. Children loved her and parents trusted her instantly. She had become the gentle face of hope for so many families. One morning, she was scheduled to speak at a new school opening, sponsored by the foundation. He couldn't make it that day, he was traveling for business. But just before the event began, she received a message from him that said, "Proud of you. You make every dream look possible." Those simple words stayed with her all day. When she spoke to the children, her voice carried warmth and strength. She told them that no dream was too small and no act of kindness was ever wasted. The crowd clapped, and somewhere in her heart she wished he could have heard it himself. Later that week, he returned to the city. He invited her to dinner at a small restaurant by the river, a quiet place away from the public eye. The evening was calm with the sound of water brushing against the dock. When she arrived, he was already waiting, holding a small box on the table. She looked at it curiously. "What's this?" she asked, sitting down. He smiled faintly. "Something for you. Not because of charity work or the rescue, but because you've become a part of my life in a way I can't explain." He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a small flame-shaped pendant. "To remind you of the day that started everything," he said quietly. "A day of courage, not tragedy." She stared at it, speechless. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But you didn't have to." "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to." She touched the charm gently, feeling the weight of its meaning. It wasn't about jewelry or gifts. It was about everything unsaid between them. Gratitude, friendship, maybe even something deeper they both feared to name. Over dinner, they talked for hours, laughing about the foundation team's funny mistakes, sharing stories from their childhoods, and remembering how life could be unpredictable yet strangely beautiful. At one point, he said, "You know, every time I see my son run and laugh, I think of you. You gave him back his future." She looked at him quietly and said, "And you gave that future a purpose." For a while, they just smiled at each other, and in that soft silence, something genuine passed between them, something that didn't need to be spoken. As weeks turned into months, the foundation reached new heights. News outlets praised the transparency and sincerity behind it. People admired not just the work being done, but the connection between the woman who had inspired it and the man who had made it possible. One evening, they attended a charity gala together, their first public appearance side by side since the beginning. The hall was filled with important people, cameras, and flashing lights. But as soon as she walked in, people turned their attention not to her dress or his reputation, but to the story that had brought them there, a story of courage and kindness that had changed countless lives. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't read from notes. He simply looked out at the audience and said, "Months ago, I nearly lost everything that mattered to me. But a stranger ran into danger and gave me a second chance. She reminded me that wealth and power mean nothing if you forget humanity. Today I stand here not as a businessman but as a father, a believer, and someone forever grateful to the person who reminded me what love really is." The crowd stood and applauded. Cameras flashed. But she didn't move. She just sat there, tears filling her eyes, realizing that sometimes the most powerful words are those that come straight from the heart. After the event, they slipped away quietly, escaping the noise and lights. They walked along the street under a soft drizzle, the air cool and clean. He handed her his jacket when he noticed her shiver slightly. "Every time I speak about that day," he said softly, "I remember how scared I was, how helpless. And then I remember you running through the fire." She smiled faintly. "I was scared too. I just didn't stop to think." "That's what makes you different," he said. "Most people think first. You act from the heart." They walked for a while without talking. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the wet pavement. At one point, she glanced at him and said quietly, "You've changed too. You're not the same man I met at that mansion." He laughed softly. "Maybe I learned what really matters. Or maybe you just reminded me." There was a pause, gentle, comfortable, full of understanding. Then he said something that made her heart tremble. "Sometimes I think that fire wasn't just a tragedy. Maybe it was the beginning of something meant to happen." She looked down, her voice almost a whisper. "Maybe it was." That night, when she returned home, she placed the bracelet beside her bed. The small flame charm gleamed faintly under the lamp. She smiled to herself, feeling grateful, not just for what had happened, but for how it had changed both of them. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from him. "There's something I want to tell you soon." But not over text. She didn't reply right away. Her heart beat faster, unsure what he meant, but somehow knowing it would matter. Over the next few days, she went about her usual work, but that message lingered in the back of her mind. When they finally met again, it was at the park where his son liked to play. The little boy ran to her as always, hugging her tightly. The man watched them for a while, then asked his driver to take his son home with the nanny so they could talk privately. They sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The sky was calm, the air full of the scent of rain. He looked at her, took a slow breath, and said, "I've wanted to say this for a long time, but I didn't know how. You've become more than a friend, more than someone who once saved my son. You've become a part of our lives I can't imagine being without." She froze for a moment, her heart racing. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "I just needed you to know." There was silence between them, not heavy or awkward, just quiet and full of meaning. The wind brushed softly against her hair, and she looked out at the water, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. Finally, she turned back to him and said softly, "Whatever this is, it's real." "And maybe that's enough for now." He smiled, relief and warmth in his eyes. "That's more than enough." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. As they sat there side by side, watching the reflection on the lake, it felt like the world had slowed again, the same way it had on the night of the fire. Only this time there was no fear, no chaos, just peace. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment it didn't matter. They had already learned that life could change in seconds, and sometimes those seconds led to something beautiful. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them only grew stronger. It wasn't rushed or loud. It was quiet, steady, and full of small, meaningful moments. Sometimes it was just shared laughter over coffee, sometimes a long walk without saying much at all. But every moment carried something that didn't need to be spoken, a sense of belonging neither of them had felt in a long time. He often found himself thinking about how everything had changed since that day. He used to live in a world of meetings, deadlines, and numbers. His life was full of noise, but somehow empty inside. Now he noticed things again: the color of the sky, the sound of his son's laughter, the peace in small silences. And he knew exactly who had brought that light back. For her, life had taken a turn she never expected. She had never imagined being part of something so big, or being so close to someone whose life was once completely different from hers. Yet she felt grounded. She still worked at the school, still walked the same roads home, but there was a new warmth in her world. Every few days his son would visit her school, running into her arms as if they had known each other forever. The boy's laughter filled the classrooms, and other children adored playing with him. She'd often catch the man watching from a distance, smiling in that quiet, proud way only a father could. One afternoon he stopped by after work to pick up his son. The children had just finished a small art project, and his little boy ran over, showing a drawing, a picture of the three of them standing together, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. She looked at it and smiled, her heart melting. He looked at it too, and something in his eyes softened even more. "Looks like he's got a good imagination," he said. "Or maybe he just drew what Ching feels," she replied. They both laughed, but deep down, they knew there was more truth in that drawing than words could say. As the weeks passed, the foundation prepared for its biggest event yet, the 1-year anniversary since it began. It was to be a celebration of every child helped, every dream rebuilt, and every life touched. She had been working day and night to make it perfect, and he insisted on helping wherever he could. When the evening of the event arrived, the hall was glowing with warm light. Families, teachers, volunteers, and children filled the space with laughter and chatter. There were banners showing photos of smiling students, and every corner of the room carried the feeling of hope. She moved around the hall, greeting guests, fixing details, making sure everything ran smoothly. When she turned around, she saw him standing near the entrance wearing a simple dark suit, looking at her with that calm smile that made her heart skip every time. "You did this," he said as she walked over. You made this night possible. We did this, she corrected him, smiling back. All of us. He shook his head lightly. Maybe, but you're the heart of it. Before she could respond, the lights dimmed and the event began. They both took their seats near the stage as a group of children performed a small play, inspired by real moments from the Foundation's journey. When it ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then it was time for speeches. She was nervous, though she had spoken in public many times before. But this night felt different. When she stood at the podium looking out at all the faces, especially his and his son's, she felt her voice tremble slightly, though her heart was steady. I never planned to be here, she began softly. A year ago, I was just living a simple life, teaching kids, going home every evening. I didn't think my life would ever cross paths with someone who would change everything I thought I knew about courage, kindness, and second chances. She paused, her eyes glancing toward him for a moment. That day was full of fear, but it brought something beautiful too. It reminded me that the smallest acts can create the biggest changes. We're all capable of doing something good, even when we're scared. And tonight, seeing all of you here, I know that goodness can spread further than we imagine. The room filled with applause. She smiled shyly, stepped down, and took her seat again. He whispered softly, "You were perfect." Later, when it was his turn to speak, he didn't look at the notes he had prepared. He spoke from the heart, his voice calm but full of emotion. A year ago, I nearly lost the most precious thing in my life. My son. I didn't know that fate was about to bring me face to face with someone who would remind me of what truly matters. I thought gratitude would be enough to repay her, but no amount of gratitude could measure what she gave me. So instead of trying to repay it, I decided to follow her example, to help others, to give back, to care. Because that's what she taught me without even meaning to. His words hung in the air, soft and powerful. People in the crowd reached for tissues, wiping tears quietly. Even she couldn't hold back the emotion that filled her chest. When the event ended, they stepped outside together. The night was cool and calm. The city lights reflected on the water nearby, and for a while neither of them spoke. The little boy had fallen asleep in the car, his head resting peacefully against the window. She looked at the man beside her and said softly, "You've done something amazing. You've changed so many lives." He smiled faintly. "You say that like I did it alone. The truth is, you changed mine first." There was silence again, not awkward, but gentle and full of things words couldn't say. Then he turned to her, his voice softer than before. "You remember the message I sent that day at the park? I never told you what I wanted to say." She nodded slowly. "I remember." He looked down for a second, then back at her. "I wanted to tell you that I care about you, not just because of what you did, but because of who you are. You've become part of my life in a way I never saw coming. And I know this might sound sudden, but I don't want this connection to fade. I want it to grow." She stood there quietly, her heart pounding. She wasn't expecting those words, not here, not now. But she also couldn't deny what she felt. Every smile, every shared silence, every small moment had led to this. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Then don't," he said gently. "Just know that whatever happens next, I'll always be thankful for you." "For everything," her eyes softened. "And I'll always be thankful for that little boy who smiled at me through the smoke," she said, a small smile appearing on her lips. He laughed quietly, his eyes warm. "He still talks about you every day. You've become his hero." She shook her head. "No, he's mine. He's the reason I didn't give up that day." The night breeze brushed past them, carrying the faint sound of music from the hall behind. The air felt peaceful, full of memories, hope, and the quiet promise of something new beginning. They stood together watching the city lights for a long time. Neither needed to say much. Some connections didn't need explanations. They just needed to be felt. In the following months, their friendship deepened even more. People often saw them working side by side at events, smiling and laughing like old friends. Some whispered that they were more than that, but neither of them cared about what others thought. What mattered was the truth they both knew, that their bond came from something real, something that had survived fire, fear, and fate. As time passed, his company continued to grow, but he made sure his foundation stayed his priority. He often said that success meant nothing without purpose, and she couldn't help but agree. She kept teaching, spending her mornings with children and her evenings helping at the foundation. It was a balance that filled her life with meaning. One day she received a letter from a young girl who had gotten a scholarship through the foundation. The girl wrote, "Thank you for believing that someone like me could have a future. You don't know me, but because of you I want to help others too." Reading those words brought tears to her eyes. It reminded her how far things had come, from that terrifying day by the road to this moment of peace and purpose. Later that evening, she met him at the small cafe they often visited. She showed him the letter and he smiled as he read it. "See," he said, "that's what you've built. Not just schools, hearts that believe in kindness." She looked at him and said softly, "No, that's what we built." He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers lightly, not out of impulse but with calm sincerity. "Then let's keep building," he said, and she nodded, smiling, because she knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would keep growing with time. The little boy, who had once been saved from fire, grew up surrounded by kindness and love. He never remembered the flames, only the warmth of the woman who held him that day. Years later, when people asked him about the scar he carried on his arm from the accident, he would smile and say, "That's where my hero grabbed me." And somewhere nearby, watching him laugh under the same sun that had once burned so fiercely, two people shared a quiet look, a look that said everything words never could. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't about grand gestures or perfect endings. They're about ordinary people who choose courage, who choose kindness, and who remind the world that even one act of love can change countless lives forever. And this story, their story, was one of them.